15,000 years ago, across a frozen continent that no longer exists in that form, hunters woke inside shelters built from the bones of the animals they hunted, checked their weapons by firelight, and stepped out into a world of permanent cold and extraordinary danger. And almost everything you have been told about those people is wrong. The world they occupied stretched in an unbroken line from what is now Spain across to Siberia and beyond. A vast, flat, wind-hammered grassland biome that scientists call the Mammoth Steppe. Ice sheets pressed down from Scandinavia. Average temperatures across Europe sat 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, colder than today. The landscape was largely treeless. Open sky reached from horizon to horizon in every direction, and moving across this enormous plain, in herds of a scale that modern ecosystems cannot match, were animals that dwarf anything alive on Earth today. What those hunters understood about this world, what they built, how they organized themselves, what they believed, is the subject of this documentary. The first thing to establish is the landscape itself, because without it, nothing else makes sense. The Mammoth Steppe was not the frozen wasteland that most people imagine when they think of the Ice Age. It was an ecosystem of extraordinary biological productivity. The cold, dry conditions that prevailed during the last glacial maximum created a grassland regime across northern Eurasia that was richer in vegetation and animal life than many modern tropical savannas. Sedge grasses, herbaceous plants, and low shrubs covered the ground in dense mats. In summer, the steppe bloomed. Rivers cut south through the landscape, fed by glacial melt. Wetlands formed along river corridors, drawing concentrations of animals. And the animals were unlike anything in the modern world. Woolly mammoths stood between 3 and 4 meters at the shoulder and weighed up to 6 tons. Their curved ivory tusks could reach 5 meters in length and were used for sweeping away snow to reach buried grasses in winter. A thick outer coat of coarse guard hair, reaching lengths of 90 centimeters on the flanks and belly, covered an undercoat of fine, dense wool that insulated against temperatures far below freezing. Beneath the skin, a layer of fat, up to 10 centimeters thick, added thermal protection and caloric reserve. These were not exotic rarities. They moved in herds across the steppe, in numbers that left trackways hundreds of meters wide in the soft seasonal ground. Alongside them lived woolly rhinoceroses, which stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder and carried a forward-sweeping horn used to clear snow from winter grazing sites. Cave lions, 20 to 30% larger than modern African lions, hunted the same prey corridors that human hunters worked. Steppe bison roamed in enormous herds. Wild horses in varieties now extinct crossed the landscape in seasonal migrations of hundreds of kilometers. Reindeer moved in numbers that modern observers who have seen the great caribou herds of northern Canada might begin to approximate. The Mammoth Steppe was one of the most productive grassland ecosystems in the history of this planet. And embedded within it, using every element of it with precision and intention, were communities of Homo sapiens as anatomically and cognitively modern as any person alive today. Excavations at sites across this landscape have dismantled every assumption about what early human life looked like. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, dated to approximately 26,000 years ago, archaeologists found the remains of a settlement with evidence of ceramic firing, the earliest known production of fired clay objects in human history. The figurines produced there, including the famous Venus of Dolní Věstonice, were fired at temperatures requiring sophisticated kiln control that predates pottery vessels by more than 15,000 years. At Sungir in Russia, burials reveal individuals interred with grave goods of staggering material investment. The site at Mezhyrich in Ukraine shows 4 circular dwellings built from the bones of approximately 100 individual mammoths, organized as a permanent or semi-permanent settlement rather than a temporary camp. At Pavlov and Predmosty, evidence of collective mammoth hunts involving the coordinated killing of dozens of animals points to a level of social organization and planning that challenges every simplistic narrative about prehistoric human capability. These were not primitives. That word, applied to these communities, is not merely inaccurate, it is a distortion that prevents a clear view of what human beings actually are and what they are actually capable of when stripped of the material infrastructure that modern civilization provides and left to operate on intelligence, observation, memory, and cooperation alone. What those capabilities produced on a single day, 15,000 years ago, is the story this documentary will tell. It begins before dawn. Inside a mammoth bone dwelling on the open steppe, the fire at the center of the floor has burned low. The air inside is dense. Animal fat, wood smoke, the particular warmth of multiple sleeping adults radiating body heat in an enclosed space. The walls around the sleeping forms are pale in the dying firelight, the smooth curves of mammoth skulls visible between stacked jaw bones, the larger femur and tibia bones interlocking overhead to create the structural frame that the mammoth hide roof rests upon. The engineering of these structures deserves a moment. At Mezhirich, the excavated dwellings ranged from 4 to 7 meters in diameter. Each required the bones of between 15 and 60 individual mammoths to construct. Lower jaws, arranged in chevron patterns, formed the base wall, interlocked to create a stable, wind-resistant perimeter. Skulls were embedded at intervals as anchor points. Long limb bones created the vertical elements of the wall. The overall structure was then completed with a frame of lighter bones and wooden poles supporting the hide roof. The construction sequence required knowledge of load distribution and structural mechanics that was not accidental. These were buildings, engineered to specific requirements for a specific climate, using the only construction material available in a treeless landscape in sufficient quantity and strength. Inside, the floor was dug below ground level, which reduced heat loss through the walls by placing the inhabited space below the worst of the wind. Storage pits cut through the floor into the permafrost below held meat, fat, and other materials at temperatures that preserved them indefinitely. A central hearth burned through the night, fueled by split mammoth bone, which contains enough residual fat and marrow to combust well and burns significantly longer and hotter than most available wood. A hunter rises. The motion is fluid and practiced. He has risen in cold and darkness more times than he can count. He reaches immediately for his clothing, which was stored close to his sleeping position to retain warmth. The outer garments are folded over a bone frame near the fire. He pulls them on in a specific sequence that has been learned over years, the inner layer first, then the middle layer, then the outer cloak. The layering system of Paleolithic cold-weather clothing is one of the most consequential and least discussed technological achievements of this period. Evidence from burial sites, particularly from Sungir in Russia, allows researchers to reconstruct the basic structure of these garments with unusual confidence. The Sungir burials, dated to approximately 32,000 years ago, preserved the spatial arrangement of more than 3,000 ivory beads distributed across each burial. The beads were originally sewn onto garments, and their positions trace the seams, cuffs, collars, and decorative panels of a complete outfit. Analysis of the bead distribution shows garments that included a fitted shirt or upper tunic, separate leg coverings that were close-fitted rather than loose, and boots. The boots show a concentration of beads at the ankle and toe that suggests structural reinforcement at points of high wear. This is not the draped hide image of popular imagination. These are tailored garments, cut and shaped to fit the body, sewn with needles. And the needles themselves are remarkable. Bone needles recovered from Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe and Russia are thin, smooth, and precisely formed, with eyes drilled through one end using stone burins. The smallest examples measure less than 3 centimeters in length and less than 1 millimeter in diameter. The skill required to produce them is significant. The skill required to sew with them, pulling sinew thread through fitted hide seams in a specific pattern to create waterproof or wind-resistant joints, is the result of years of practice. The hunter's boots are insulated with dried grass, packed between two layers of hide, a technique used by Arctic peoples well into the 20th century and documented as far back as the Paleolithic. His mittens attached to his sleeves at the wrist to prevent gaps that wind could exploit. His hood seals around his face, leaving only the eyes and nose exposed. In this configuration, he is equipped to operate continuously in temperatures that would be life-threatening to an unclothed or poorly clothed modern person within minutes. Now he takes up his weapons. The spear rests against the wall near the entrance. The shaft is approximately 2 meters long, made from a straightened sapling that was heated, bent, and allowed to dry under tension to run perfectly true. It is smooth to the touch, slightly tapered toward the tip. At the forward end, a stone projectile point is hafted into a socket carved into the shaft, secured with a binding of dampened sinew that has dried tight, and a coating of natural adhesive, pine pitch mixed with powdered bone, that bonds the connection with a rigidity that will not loosen under impact. The point itself is a masterwork of controlled fracture. Producing a functional Paleolithic projectile point begins with the selection of the right flint, chert, or obsidian. The material must be fine-grained and homogeneous, without internal fracture planes that would cause unpredictable breakage under pressure. Knowing which rock will behave correctly requires training and experience. The initial shaping process, called flint knapping, uses a series of controlled strikes with a stone or bone hammer to rough out the basic form, then transitions to pressure flaking, applying a pointed antler or bone tool to the edge of the stone with controlled pressure to remove thin, precise flakes one at a time. Each flake removed thins and sharpens the point, while simultaneously creating new edge geometry for the next flake. A finished Upper Paleolithic projectile point is often thin enough to be slightly translucent in certain light. The edges, examined under magnification, show a regularity and sharpness that rivals modern surgical instruments. Studies measuring edge sharpness of Paleolithic flint tools have found them comparable to or exceeding the sharpness of modern steel scalpel blades in fresh condition. They dull faster, but fresh, they cut. The hunter checks the hafting joint by pressing the point laterally and feeling for any flex that would indicate a loosening of the binding. Satisfied, he picks up the second critical element of his weapon system, the atlatl. An atlatl is a spear-throwing lever, typically 30 to 60 centimeters in length, carved from wood or bone, with a hooked distal end that engages the butt of the spear shaft. The hunter places the butt of the spear against the hook, holds both atlatl and spear shaft together in the throwing hand, and during the throw, releases the spear shaft while retaining the atlatl. The hook maintains contact with the butt of the spear through the acceleration phase, effectively extending the length of the throwing arm by the length of the atlatl. This extended lever arm increases the arc through which the spear accelerates before release, which increases the velocity of the projectile at the moment it leaves the hand. The physics are precise and consequential. Experimental archaeology studies using replica Paleolithic atlatls have documented projectile velocities exceeding 150 kilometers per hour. Effective, accurate ranges have been measured at 30 to 40 meters against target-sized objects. These are not extreme outlier results from exceptional throwers. They are averages from people with moderate practice using historically accurate replicas. A skilled adult hunter who had been practicing atlatl throwing since childhood and for whom the motion was as natural as breathing would exceed these benchmarks. At 35 meters, a spear, launched by atlatl, carries sufficient kinetic energy to penetrate the thick hide and subcutaneous fat layer of a woolly mammoth and reach internal organs. This is not theoretical. Projectile points have been recovered embedded in mammoth skeletal material at multiple sites, with the angle of penetration and depth of entry consistent with atlatl-powered throws rather than hand-thrown spears. The hunter stows several replacement points in a pouch at his belt. He has extras because points break. On impact with bone, they shatter. On a miss into rock or frozen ground, they fracture. The ability to replace a point in the field, quickly, from pre-made spares, is part of the system design. He takes a length of spare sinew and a small amount of adhesive packed in a folded bark container. He pulls on his outer cloak, wraps dried meat in a scrap of hide, and tucks it inside his clothing against his body, where his body heat will keep it from freezing solid. He crouches at the entrance to the dwelling and pushes through the hide-covered door. The cold arrives before his face clears the doorframe. It is absolute, immediate, and savage. His exhaled breath becomes a cloud of white vapor. His eyes adjust to the starlit darkness outside. The temperature is below -20 degrees Celsius. The air is still, which is fortunate. Wind at this temperature would make the cold lethal within minutes, even for someone as well equipped as he is. The steppe under starlight is not dark in the way that a forest is dark. Starlight reflected off snow-covered ground creates a flat, pale luminescence that reaches to the horizon in every direction. The treeless landscape has no shadowed areas, no deep darkness beneath canopies. Visibility, even without a moon, extends to several hundred meters. He can see others moving from the other dwellings. A group of 5 other adults converges at the edge of the settlement without speaking. Communication is unnecessary. The plan was established the evening before, worked out in detail around the fire as tracking information from the afternoon was analyzed and the approach strategy was set. The river crossing is 4 kilometers northeast. They move out immediately, walking fast to generate warmth, maintaining a spacing that allows each person to watch their footing while keeping the group together. The frozen steppe is not uniform. Snowdrift patterns reveal wind directions and obstacles. Old animal trails offer firmer footing. The lead hunter reads the landscape ahead with the fluency of someone who has crossed this terrain hundreds of times in every season and every light condition. The physical capability of these adults deserves to be stated clearly. Studies of Paleolithic skeletal remains from multiple European sites show bone density and musculoskeletal robusticity significantly exceeding modern sedentary population averages. The femoral shaft, the thigh bone, in Paleolithic specimens often shows structural properties more similar to those of modern elite endurance athletes than to typical modern adults. Enthesial changes, the visible markings on bone where major muscle groups attached, indicate levels of sustained physical loading across a lifetime that would be exceptional by any modern standard. These adults moved fast and far without effort. Walking 4 kilometers across frozen terrain in the pre-dawn dark was not an exertion. It was the beginning of a day whose physical demands would continue for 10 or more hours without pause. The sky was lightening from black to deep blue to grey as they reached the river corridor. The river was partially frozen, a channel of moving water running between shelves of ice that extended from each bank. At the crossing, the banks widened and the water shallowed to less than a meter in depth over a gravel bottom. This was where the mammoth herd would cross. The group fanned out to their pre-assigned positions without discussion. 2 hunters moved left to a low ridge that gave them an elevated angle over the crossing. 2 others moved right toward a point of firm ground close to the far bank. One positioned himself behind a cluster of large embedded boulders near the water's edge. The 6th, the most experienced among them, took a central position with a clear sightline to the area where the animals would enter the water. They settled into stillness. The cold became the primary challenge. In motion, generating body heat through exertion, cold is manageable. In stillness, in air this cold, the body's heat output drops, while heat loss through conduction and radiation continues. Every hunter was managing his position, standing rather than crouching where possible, shifting weight periodically to maintain circulation in his feet, pressing his hands against his torso when not actively holding his weapons. The ground began to vibrate before the sounds arrived. Mammoths communicate across distances of several kilometers using low-frequency vocalizations that fall partly below the range of human hearing, felt through the ground as much as heard through the air. Communities living in close proximity to mammoth herds for multiple generations develop sensitivity to these vibrations that may not be fully explicable by normal hearing alone. The experienced hunters of this band had been reading mammoth ground vibration since childhood. Direction, distance, approximate herd size, movement speed, all of it was encoded in the pattern of tremors that arrived through the permafrost. The herd was approaching from the northwest, moving steadily. No sign of agitation in the vibration pattern, perhaps 20 to 30 individuals. Then the sounds resolved into audible range, the deep rhythmic percussion of enormous feet on frozen ground, the crack and snap of vegetation being pushed aside, the occasional low, hollow rumble of mammoth vocalization. And then the shapes emerged from the grey morning light at the far edge of the crossing, massive, shaggy silhouettes moving with a ponderous inevitability, their breath rising in enormous clouds above their heads, their curved tusks pale against the darker scrub behind them. The hunters held absolute position. Target selection was the first critical decision of the hunt, and it was made quietly, through a series of small gestures and eye movements between the most experienced hunters as the herd approached. They were not looking for the largest animal. Largest meant youngest adult male, strongest, fastest, and most aggressive when threatened. They were looking for specific behavioral markers, slight asymmetry of gait, a tendency to lag at the edge of the group, hesitation at the water's edge. The selected animal was a large adult female at the right margin of the herd as it approached the crossing. Her right rear leg showed a subtle offloading pattern, a reduction in weight bearing on the final step before each new stride. It was barely visible. The hunters had been watching for it since the herd came into view. To an observer without their experience and training, the animal appeared identical to the others. To the hunters, it was distinct. The herd entered the crossing. The moment of the first throw was determined by position and opportunity, not by signal. Each hunter in position watched the target animal and made their own assessment of angle, distance, and probability of penetration. The two hunters on the left ridge had the clearest shots as the animal entered mid-crossing and turned slightly toward the far bank. The atlatl came up. The motion was smooth, practiced to the point of automaticity, the spear extending forward and accelerating through the throwing arc with a controlled violence that delivered the full kinetic energy of a strong adult male human body through approximately 1 meter of lever arm into a stone-tipped shaft. The impact was audible across the crossing. A hard, flat percussion. The herd exploded. 3 tons of accumulated evolutionary anxiety, perfectly calibrated to detect and respond to sudden threat, scattered every animal in every direction simultaneously. The churning of the crossing produced a roar of water and gravel and ice. The rest of the hunters rose from their positions. The target animal had moved into deeper water. It was crossing, but something was wrong with the movement pattern. The rear leg was tracking differently. It was carrying one of the hunter's spears in its flank, below the shoulder blade, at an angle that the hunters recognized as promising but not immediately decisive. 2 more throws followed from the right bank position as the animal cleared the crossing and reached the far bank. One missed. The second struck above the first, at a slightly steeper angle. The animal trumpeted, a sound that struck the listening hunters physically, a raw wall of acoustic energy that resonated in the chest cavity. What followed was not cinematic. It was methodical, careful, and dangerous for at least another hour. A wounded mammoth is more dangerous than an unhurt one. The pain response triggers aggression, and the animal had not lost significant enough blood or suffered sufficient internal damage to impair its speed or strength. 2 hunters maintained a rotating pressure from different angles, keeping the animal's attention divided, while the others circled to less exposed positions. The animal charged twice, short explosive rushes that the hunters broke by separating and moving away from each other at right angles, splitting the target and forcing the animal to abort the charge and turn. On the third charge attempt, it stopped mid-stride. The process from first contact to the moment the animal went down took approximately 90 minutes. What followed the kill was as organized as the hunt itself. Processing a woolly mammoth required the entire available adult labor force working together for the better part of a day. The animal yields roughly 900 kilograms of usable muscle meat alone. The fat deposits, concentrated in thick layers beneath the hide and in the marrow of every major bone, represent an additional several hundred kilograms of the most calorically dense material available. The hide, when processed, yields enough leather to cover a dwelling or provide clothing for multiple people. The ivory from both tusks could supply a craftsman's material needs for a year. The bones would eventually become structural elements of new dwellings or fuel for winter fires. Nothing was left behind that had utility. The material economy of a Paleolithic hunting band was built on total resource extraction because the cost of every kill was measured in days of planning, hours of danger, and the constant background risk of injury or death. Organ meats were removed and consumed first. The liver, kidneys, and heart spoil within hours in warmer conditions, though the cold extended this window. They were eaten at the kill site, raw, or briefly fire-cooked over a small fire built from nearby scrubwood. Consumed immediately after a successful hunt, these organs delivered concentrated iron, vitamin B12, fat-soluble vitamins, and micronutrients that were less available in long-stored muscle meat. Hunter-gatherer studies worldwide consistently show that organ meats are prioritized at kill sites for exactly this reason. Bone marrow was the second priority. Long bones were split with heavy stone choppers, the marrow scooped out and consumed directly or heated to render the fat content into a liquid that could be drunk, poured over other food, or stored. Marrow fat is approximately 90% fat by mass, delivering more than 800 calories per 100 grams. A single femur from an adult mammoth could contain more than a kilogram of marrow. Multiply that across every long bone of the skeleton, and the caloric yield from bone processing alone was substantial. The rest of the work, hide removal, meat slicing and portioning, bone and ivory separation, continued through the morning and into the afternoon. Meat was sliced thin and either loaded for transport back to camp or laid on frames of spear shafts over a small fire to begin the drying process. The cold would finish what the fire started. Dried meat stored in the permafrost cache at the settlement would remain stable for weeks. As the processing continued, a runner had gone back to camp at the moment of the kill to alert the rest of the band. By mid-morning, additional adults had arrived to join the work. With more hands, the rate of processing increased. By early afternoon, the carcass had been substantially reduced, and the first loads of material were being transported back to the settlement. Back at camp, the morning had not been idle. While the hunters were at the river crossing, a different set of activities occupied those who remained at the settlement. Hide working, tool production, food preparation, clothing repair, and the ongoing management of the camp's material stores were all essential activities that could not simply pause when the hunters left. Hide processing is among the most physically demanding of the non-hunting tasks. A fresh mammoth hide is heavy, rigid, and hostile to human effort. The first stage of processing requires scraping away the subcutaneous fat and connective tissue from the inner surface of the hide while it is still fresh and workable. A stone scraper, held in the hand and drawn repeatedly across the surface, removes tissue layer by layer. The work is repetitive and requires sustained physical effort over hours. A single large hide might require half a day of continuous scraping to complete this initial stage. The second stage, softening the hide, requires working the dampened hide repeatedly with the hands and a blunt working tool to break down the collagen fibers that, if left untreated, would cause the hide to dry stiff as wood. One of the most effective agents for softening processed hide is the brain of the animal itself, which contains natural emulsifying compounds that penetrate the hide and maintain the suppleness of the fibers after drying. Animal brain was a known and deliberately preserved hide-working material at Paleolithic sites. The process of fully softening and preparing a large hide could extend across several days of intermittent work. Given the material value of each hide, shelter, clothing, storage, it was worth every hour invested. Tool production was equally continuous. Stone projectile points broke in use and needed replacement. Scrapers dulled and needed resharpening or replacement. Bone needles broke and needed to be replaced. The napper's position in the settlement, surrounded by the debris of worked stone, the small chips and flakes that constitute the byproducts of tool production, was a recognizable sight feature at every Paleolithic encampment. Flint knapping was a skill that required years to develop. Beginning with coarse hammerstone percussion to establish the basic form of a point, the process transitioned to finer work using soft hammers of antler or bone, and finally to pressure flaking using a pointed antler tine or copper hardness bone tool to place individual, precise flakes along the edges. Each stage required different hand positions, different applied force levels, and a reading of the stone's behavior that developed only through extensive practice and, in many cases, explicit instruction from experienced knappers. The transmission of this knowledge from one generation to the next was a primary educational task of the community. Adult expert knappers worked alongside apprentices, demonstrating and correcting. The stone tools produced by less experienced knappers are visibly distinguishable from those of experts in the archaeological record, less regular, with more evidence of error correction and wasted material. Over time, the assemblages show improvement. The archaeological record is, among other things, a record of learning. As afternoon moved toward evening and the hunters began returning with their loads of meat and hide and bone, the social dynamics of the settlement shifted. The return of hunters from a successful kill was not merely a practical event, it was a social event of the first order, structured by the obligations and reciprocities that held the band together. Distribution of the kill followed established rules understood by everyone in the group. Specific portions went to specific categories of people: the hunter who threw the first spear that struck, those who had led the previous day's tracking, the oldest adults who could no longer hunt but whose knowledge was still essential to the group's survival, and those recovering from injury. The allocation was precise and non-negotiable. Violations of the distribution rules were serious social transgressions in hunter-gatherer communities because they undermined the insurance system that every member of the group depended on. The logic of this sharing is not altruism in the modern sense. It is rational risk management applied to the uncertainty of food availability. A hunter who kills alone and keeps everything has more food today but faces greater caloric risk over time than a hunter who distributes freely and can expect others to distribute to him. The band-level sharing of large game kills is one of the most consistently documented features of human forager societies worldwide, observed across cultures on every continent where hunting remained the primary food acquisition strategy into the historical period. This evening, with a successful kill to distribute, the settlement was in good spirits. Not in a simple or uncomplicated way. The injuries that the lead hunter had sustained during the second charge, a bruised rib from a glancing impact with the animal's flank as he moved to avoid the charge, were real and would limit his mobility for the next week. But the band had meat. The storage pits would be restocked. The cold was held back by the fire and the walls of bone. The children were fed. And now, in the firelight of the long winter evening, the other life of these communities came forward. The relationship between the material world and the symbolic world of Upper Paleolithic communities is one of the most remarkable and persistently underappreciated dimensions of the archaeological record. We have grown accustomed to thinking of art, music, ritual, and symbolic communication as relatively recent additions to human behavior, things that arrived sometime after language and before civilization. The evidence does not support this view. The bone flute found at Hohlefels in Germany, carved from the radius bone of a Eurasian griffon vulture, is dated to approximately 43,000 years ago. It has 4 finger holes spaced for pentatonic or other scale structures. It was playable when discovered. More fragments of similar instruments have been found at multiple Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe. Music was not a cultural novelty 15,000 years ago. It was ancient. Cave paintings at Chauvet in southern France, dated to approximately 36,000 years ago, depict woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, mammoths, horses, and aurochs with a dynamism and anatomical accuracy that still stops art historians. The artists used perspective, showing overlapping animal forms to create depth. They used shading to model three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional surface. They selected cave walls with natural protrusions, where the rock surface itself contributed to the three-dimensional appearance of the painted animal. In the Chauvet Cave's Megaloceros Gallery, a painted mammoth was positioned so that a natural bulge in the cave wall gives the animal's shoulder a three-dimensional roundness that no flat painting could achieve. These images were not made for casual viewing. They were placed in chambers accessible only by crawling through narrow passages for distances of up to several hundred meters from the cave entrance, using small oil lamps as the only light source. The chambers they were placed in were selected for acoustic properties. Studies of cave painting sites have found consistent correlations between decorated chambers and chambers with particular resonance characteristics, chambers where drumming, singing, or musical instruments produce unusual echo effects and standing waves. Reaching these chambers, creating the images inside them, was a deliberate act of significant effort under conditions of physical challenge and psychological isolation from the external world. Whatever these acts meant to the people performing them, they were not casual. They were important enough to demand sustained preparation and execution. The Venus figurines found at sites stretching from France to Siberia represent a shared symbolic vocabulary across an enormous geographic and cultural range. These carved figures of adult female forms, produced in ivory, bone, limestone, and fired clay, appear at sites dating from approximately 35,000 to 12,000 years ago. Thousands of examples have been recovered. Whatever their specific meaning, the consistency of the form across such a vast geographic range and time span indicates a shared cultural tradition maintained and transmitted across generations and across the distances that separated distinct communities. And at the center of this symbolic world, again and again, was the mammoth. The mammoth is among the most frequently depicted animals in European cave art. It appears in paintings, in engravings, and as the subject of carved ivory figurines. Mammoth ivory was the premium material for the most significant carved objects: the Venus figurines, the animal figurines, the spear-thrower hooks decorated with sculpted animals. The bones of the mammoth built the dwellings. The fat of the mammoth fueled the lamps that lit the caves where the mammoth's image was painted on the walls. The mammoth was not merely food, it was the material basis of an entire civilization, and simultaneously, it seems, a central figure in the spiritual architecture of that civilization. This makes what came next not merely an ecological event, but a civilizational catastrophe. Beginning approximately 12,000 years ago and accelerating through the following millennia, the mammoth steppe ecosystem began to collapse. The causes were not singular. The climate of the northern hemisphere was shifting as the last glacial maximum gave way to the warmer Holocene. The cold, dry conditions that had sustained the vast grassland biome were replaced by warmer, wetter conditions that transformed the landscape. In Western Europe, forests advanced northward. The open steppe shrank and fragmented. In Siberia, the permafrost softened in parts of the summer range, and the vegetation communities that had supported megafaunal herds gave way to different plant associations that the mammoths had not evolved to exploit. The herds thinned, the range contracted. Calving rates may have declined as the nutritional quality of available forage fell. Population densities dropped across the steppe as the habitat productivity that had sustained them decreased. At the same time, human populations were expanding and their technological capabilities were developing in directions that increased hunting pressure precisely when megafaunal populations were most vulnerable. The bow and arrow appeared in the archaeological record of Europe toward the end of this period, replacing the atlatl as the primary long-range hunting technology. The bow offered higher rates of fire, greater effective range under most field conditions, and the ability to hunt from a more concealed position than the atlatl's more open throwing motion required. A skilled archer could loose several arrows before an alarmed animal could clear effective range. The bow dramatically increased the per-hunter kill rate for mobile prey. Human populations were also growing. Group territories were shrinking. The frequency of contact between human bands was increasing. As groups competed for access to declining megafaunal herds, the hunting pressure on those herds intensified from multiple directions simultaneously. The woolly mammoth's reproductive rate was its evolutionary weakness in this context. A female mammoth, like a modern elephant, carried a pregnancy of approximately 22 months and produced a single calf. The calf required years of intensive care and nursing before independence. A mammoth population reproduces slowly, and a slowly reproducing population cannot compensate for elevated adult mortality rates with increased birth rates. When the kill rate rose above the reproduction rate, the population began to decline. Not dramatically at first, not in ways that any individual hunter could observe in the span of a human lifetime, but across generations. The herds were smaller, the crossings were less crowded, the tracking took longer, the return on hunting effort was falling. This is one of the defining patterns of human ecological impact. Consequences that unfold across generational timescales, invisible to the individuals whose aggregate behavior is driving them. The hunter who rose before dawn 15,000 years ago and killed a mammoth at a river crossing was not destroying the world. He was feeding his family and following the deepest logic of his survival system. The system itself, operating over time, at expanding scale, was doing something that no individual decision could have anticipated or prevented. The last mainland mammoth populations disappeared approximately 10,000 years ago. An isolated island population survived on St. Paul Island in the Bering Sea until approximately 5,600 years ago. The final known mammoth population on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean northeast of Siberia survived until approximately 1700 BCE, the approximate period of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. The last mammoths died on Earth at roughly the time that the biblical patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, are traditionally placed by scholars working from the Genesis chronology. The gap between the world of the mammoth hunter and the world of the Bible is not as vast as it first appears. It is a distance of perhaps 10,000 years, measured from the last great era of the mammoth steppe to the earliest narratives preserved in the Hebrew scriptures. In that interval, the communities whose entire material and spiritual civilization had been organized around the mammoth and the other megafauna of the Pleistocene steppe were forced into one of the most radical adaptive transitions in human history. The adaptation was agriculture. The shift from foraging to farming did not happen in a moment, and it was not a straightforward improvement. The earliest agricultural communities show evidence of reduced dietary diversity, increased incidence of nutritional deficiency diseases, higher rates of infectious disease due to close proximity of humans and domestic animals, increased physical workload, and in many early sites, reduced average stature compared to preceding hunter-gatherer populations. Agriculture was not adopted because it was easier or better by most measurable quality of life metrics. It was adopted because it provided caloric security, predictable, storable food from a fixed location, at a moment when the mobile, megafauna-centered economy of the Paleolithic was becoming less viable. Out of the fixed settlement that agriculture required, everything that we now call civilization emerged: cities, trade networks, writing, legal systems, organized religion with permanent priesthoods and temples, social stratification, armies, the entire material and social infrastructure that the biblical world takes as its background assumption. The world that the Hebrew Bible describes, of farmers and shepherds and city dwellers, of merchants in market cities, of priests in stone temples, of kings in palace complexes, is the world that grew out of the wreckage of the Pleistocene. The people who wrote those texts were not aware of the mammoth hunters. The memory of the mammoth steppe had dissolved entirely, leaving no recoverable trace in the oral traditions that eventually became scripture. And yet something persists. When the Psalms speak of God providing food for animals, of the young lions roaring for their prey, of the great and wide sea full of creatures both small and great, the poet is drawing on a relationship with the animal world that is the most fundamental layer of human experience. The instinct to see divinity in the act of the hunt, to understand the provision of animal life as a gift from a higher power, to feel the weight of moral obligation to the creature that sustains you. These are not theological innovations of the Iron Age. They are inheritances from a cognitive and spiritual architecture built on the frozen steppe, in darkness, before agriculture, before cities, before writing. When Genesis establishes the human being as a caretaker of the animal world, or when the prophetic literature uses the behavior of wild animals as a lens for understanding divine intention, the writers are using the deepest available vocabulary for the relationship between humans and the non-human world, a vocabulary whose grammar was written in the Ice Age and whose earliest texts were painted on cave walls with ochre and charcoal by the light of fat lamps. The mammoth hunter who rose before dawn 15,000 years ago checked his weapons by firelight inside a house built from mammoth bones and stepped out into the freezing dark toward a river crossing where something enormous was going to cross. That person lived at the origin point of everything we are now. He had no writing, he had no cities, he had no permanent temples and no organized priesthood. He had a band of people who depended on him, a landscape that he understood with a precision that no modern person could match, a set of tools that represented the accumulated technical knowledge of hundreds of generations, and a spiritual life whose depth we can only infer from the extraordinary art and ritual evidence he left behind. What he knew about endurance, about patience, about the obligations of community, about the relationship between human beings and the natural world, what he knew about what it costs to sustain life in conditions of genuine hardship and genuine danger, was not lost when the mammoth disappeared and the world changed. It was compressed, transmitted in forms that became less and less recognizable over time, folded into the stories that human beings tell each other about where they come from and what they owe each other and what moves in the dark at the edge of the firelight. The question is not what those hunters were capable of. The evidence of that is overwhelming and clear. The question is what we have forgotten about what human beings are built to endure and what it might cost us to have forgotten it.